The call came on a Tuesday. I remember because I had just finished watering my tomato plants, the ones I'd been trying to keep alive on the windowsill of room 14, when the phone rang and my brother's voice came through the line like something I hadn't heard in years. Warm, worried, real. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Ruth. I'm 67 years old, and for 31 of those years, I was a middle school English teacher in Dayton, Ohio. I loved my job. I loved my students. I loved the smell of chalk and old paperback novels, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a classroom when 25 kids are actually reading. I retired at 62 with a modest pension, a small savings account, and what I believed, truly believed, was a loving family. I was wrong about one of those things. My husband Gerald passed away 4 years before I retired. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks. From diagnosis to the end. We didn't have time to say half the things we meant to say, and I spent the first year after his death walking through my days, like someone moving through water. Everything was slow, muffled, heavy. My son, Derek, lived 40 minutes away in Columbus with his wife, Tammy. They came to the funeral, of course. They brought food. They sat with me for a weekend, and then they went back to their lives, which I understood. People have lives. I didn't hold it against them. What I held against them came later. It started small, the way these things always do. Derek began calling more often after Gerald died, not to check on me, I would eventually realize, but to check on the house. Gerald and I had paid off our mortgage 12 years before he passed. We owned a 3-bedroom colonial on a quiet street in Dayton. Not a mansion, but a solid house. A house with a rose garden that Gerald had planted the year we moved in, and a porch where we used to drink coffee on Sunday mornings and read the paper. That house was worth something. Derek mentioned once, maybe 8 months after Gerald's death, that the upkeep of a big house must be difficult for a woman alone. I said I managed fine. He mentioned it again at Thanksgiving, and again at Christmas. By the following spring, he was mentioning it every time I saw him. And Tammy had started adding her voice to the chorus. Gentle at first, then less so. Mom, you're not getting any younger. That was Tammy's line. She said it so often I started to hear it in my sleep. They suggested I move in with them. I declined. I liked my independence. I liked my house, my garden, my neighbors, the walk to the library on Saturday mornings. I liked my life, but Derek and Tammy were persistent in a way that wore me down slowly, like water on stone. They didn't argue. They worried. There is a particular kind of manipulation that wears the costume of concern, and I did not recognize it for what it was until far too late. The real pressure began after I fell. It was February, ice on the back steps, my own foolishness for not salting them. I broke my wrist, my right wrist, which made everything harder, and spent 3 days in the hospital and 2 weeks moving between Derek's house and my own while I healed. During those 2 weeks, Derek had conversations with me that I now understand were not conversations at all. They were transactions. He would bring me coffee and sit across from me with that expression, that careful, practiced expression of concern, and talk about how frightening it had been to get the call about my fall. How he worried every day. How Tammy worried. How they both lay awake at night thinking about what might happen next time. We just want to make sure you're taken care of, Mom, he said. We want you somewhere safe. I signed documents during those 2 weeks. I should not have. My wrist was in a cast. I was on pain medication that left me foggy and slow, and Derek presented papers to me one evening at the kitchen table with the same calm confidence he used for everything, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. A power of attorney, he explained, just in case, just so that if something happened, if I became incapacitated, he could manage things on my behalf. He said a lawyer had drawn it up. He said it was standard. I trusted my son. I signed. What I did not read, what I should have read, were the sections that gave him not just emergency power but broad financial authority, the ability to manage, transfer, and liquidate assets. I did not read those parts. I took his word for it. Because he was my son, and I had raised him, and I could not imagine that the boy I had read to sleep every night for 10 years had grown into someone who would use that trust against me. The nursing home was Tammy's idea. I know that now. They presented it to me 6 months later, Meadow Creek Care Center. They called it as a trial, just for a little while, just to see how I liked it. There was a garden, Derek said, activities. Other people my age. I would not be lonely. I was not, I want to be clear, sick. I was 65 years old with a healed wrist and a working mind, and absolutely no medical reason to be in a facility of any kind. But by then, the power of attorney was in place, and Derek had quietly had my name transferred from several financial accounts under the pretext of protecting them. And I was tired in a way that went beyond the physical. Grief does that. Prolonged grief and prolonged pressure applied steadily by people you love. You start to wonder if they're right. You start to wonder if you really are too old to manage. You start to let go of things just to make the worry stop. I let go of too many things. I moved into Meadow Creek in September. My house, Gerald's, and my house, the house with the rose garden, was listed for sale in October. Derek said it was the practical choice. He said the proceeds would fund my care. When I asked to see the accounts, there were reasons I couldn't. Tammy was handling it, Derek said. The paperwork was complicated. He would explain everything soon. Soon never came. The room was small. I had a window that looked out at a parking lot, and a bathroom I shared with the woman next door, and a narrow bed with institutional sheets. I had brought some of my books, a photograph of Gerald, the small blue lamp from our bedroom, room 14. I kept those tomato plants alive on the windowsill because I needed to keep something alive. I needed to tend something. I was not unhappy every moment. There were kind people at Meadow Creek, a nurse named Patricia who always remembered to ask about my garden, an aide named Marcus who brought me an extra blanket without being asked on cold nights. There were other residents I spoke to, women my age and older who had their own quiet griefs and who understood without explanation the particular loneliness of being placed somewhere by people who called it care. But I was angry. Beneath the fog and the fatigue, I was furious. I had worked for 31 years. I had paid into a pension. I had a savings account, or I'd had one. When I asked Derek directly, in one of his increasingly infrequent visits, about my finances, about where the money from the house sale had gone, about why my pension deposits were no longer appearing in the account he had reluctantly shown me once on his phone, he said things were being managed. He said I didn't need to worry. He said I was getting the best care. He stopped visiting as often after I started asking questions. By month 4, he came once a month. By month 6, Tammy stopped coming entirely. They called on Sundays, sometimes. Short calls. Everything is fine, Mom. We'll come see you soon. My brother, Warren, lives in Portland, Oregon. He is 3 years younger than me, and we have always been close. Though close the way adult siblings are close, across long distances, phone calls on birthdays and holidays. Visits every year or two, a shorthand between us that time never quite erases. Warren is a retired civil engineer. His wife, Carol, teaches piano from their home. They are not wealthy in the way that word is usually meant. But Warren built their life carefully and wisely, and they are comfortable in the way that people are comfortable when they have spent decades making sensible decisions. Warren had not known I was at Meadow Creek. Derek had told him, apparently, that I had chosen to move there, that I had decided, independently and happily, to transition into assisted living, that I was thriving. Warren had called the number. Derek gave him a number I later learned was forwarded through Derek's own phone, which means some of my calls had been monitored and some had not gone through at all. I had tried to call Warren twice in those first months. I had believed he simply hadn't called back. He had never received those calls. The call that came on a Tuesday, the one I mentioned at the beginning, was Warren calling the main desk at Meadow Creek directly. He had been trying to reach me for 3 weeks. He told me later, and finally looked up the facility and called the general line. Patricia answered. Patricia, bless her, brought the phone to room 14. Ruthie, my brother said, and something in my chest cracked open because nobody had called me that in so long. I told him everything. I don't know how long we were on that phone. The nurses didn't rush me, not that day, and I told him about the power of attorney and the house and the accounts and the visits that had stopped and the questions that went unanswered. My voice shook for part of it and was steady for part of it, and Warren listened the way he has always listened to me, completely and without interrupting. When I finished, there was a silence. Then he said, very quietly, I'm coming. Warren flew in 4 days later. He did not come to Meadow Creek first. He went to see an elder law attorney. a woman named Sandra Chen who specialized in cases like mine, financial exploitation of older adults, it's called. And it is more common than most people want to believe. Warren had done his homework on that plane. He had printed documents, made notes, organized everything with the precision of a man who had spent his career managing complicated systems. When he came to see me at Meadow Creek, he sat across from me in the common room and held my hands across the table and said, "I'm not leaving you here. I want to be honest about what that moment was." It was not simply relief. It was something older and deeper than relief. It was the feeling of being seen by someone who had known you your entire life, who remembered you before the grief and the fatigue and the slow surrender of your own life, who was looking at you now and recognizing you underneath all of that. It was the particular grace of being claimed, of someone saying you matter to me, specifically, and I am not going to let this continue. I cried. He cried a little too, though he would deny it. Sandra Chen filed paperwork the following week to challenge the power of attorney on the grounds of undue influence and potential financial exploitation. Warren had also contacted Adult Protective Services, and a caseworker named Diane had opened an investigation. These things move slowly. I want to be truthful about that. There is no version of this story where justice arrived quickly or cleanly. There were weeks of waiting, of phone calls, of documents and counter-documents, of Derek leaving long voicemails for me that swung between apologetic and defensive and, eventually, threatening. He called one evening and said that I was confused, that I had always been a little confused, that Warren was taking advantage of my emotional state, and that when this was over, when I came to my senses, I would regret having done this to my own son. I wrote down what he said. Sandra had told me to document everything. Warren, in the meantime, had moved me out of Meadow Creek. He had found a small rental house, a one-story, two-bedroom place with a backyard in a neighborhood about 20 minutes from the facility. He paid the first 3 months' rent himself. He bought groceries. He drove me to Sandra's office for every meeting. Carol flew out and spent 2 weeks helping me settle in, hanging curtains, putting books on shelves, finding a spot in the backyard where the sun was good and the soil was manageable. I planted roses in that backyard. It was late in the season for it, and Carol said they might not take, but I planted them anyway. Gerald's roses had been left behind at the house on Maple Street, the house Derek had sold, and I needed to start something new with my hands. The investigation found what Warren had suspected. The house had been sold, and the proceeds, just over $300,000, had been transferred into an account in Derek's name. My pension deposits routed through a joint account I hadn't fully understood I'd signed for had been quietly redirected over 14 months. The total amounted to over $60,000 in pension funds, plus the house proceeds. Sandra filed a civil suit. The district attorney's office, after reviewing the caseworker's findings, opened a separate criminal inquiry. Derek's attorney called Sandra the week before the civil case was scheduled for mediation. Derek was, his attorney said, prepared to settle. I did not want to settle. I want to be honest about that too. I was angry, not the foggy, helpless anger of Meadow Creek, but a clear and focused anger, the kind that comes when you finally understand exactly what was done to you and by whom. Warren sat with me the evening before I had to make the decision, and we talked for a long time on the back porch of the rental house, and he said something I have thought about many times since. He said, "You get to decide what kind of ending this is, Ruthie." Not him, I settled. The terms required full repayment, the house proceeds, the redirected pension funds, interest, and legal costs. It required that Derek relinquish any and all claim to my estate or future finances. It required a formal acknowledgement, in writing, of what had been done. That last part was Sandra's idea, and I was glad for it. I wanted it in writing. I wanted Derek to sign a document that said, plainly, what he had done to his mother. He signed it. I heard he and Tammy separated 8 months later, though I did not seek that information out. I heard it from a neighbor's daughter who still lived near the old house. I felt very little about it, which surprised me and then didn't. What I want to tell you about now is what Warren did, and I want to tell it clearly, because it is the part that matters most, and the part that I think people do not always hear enough. Warren did not simply pay for things and fly home. He stayed for 2 months. He restructured my finances with Sandra's help. and with my full understanding of every document I signed, reading each one aloud to me, answering every question, so that my pension and a portion of the settlement were placed into a properly structured trust. He found me a fee-only financial advisor, a woman named Gloria, who sat with me for 3 hours during our first meeting and explained everything in plain language, and never once made me feel foolish for not having known it before. He set up a system not complicated but clear, so that I would always know exactly what I had and where it was and who could access it. He made sure that I understood that knowledge was my protection now, not trust alone. Trust is necessary and beautiful, he said, but knowledge is the thing that cannot be taken from you. He flew home to Portland in November. Carol cried at the airport. I cried at the airport. Warren gave me a long hug and said, "You call me every Sunday." I said I would. I have. I have been in the rental house for almost 2 years now. The roses came back in the spring, 2 of the 4 I planted, which Carol said was actually quite good for a late planting. I have a small vegetable garden now, beds I built with help from my neighbor, a retired postal worker named George, who has an opinion about everything and is usually right about half of it. I drive myself to the library on Saturday mornings. I have a standing Tuesday lunch with 2 women I met through a senior community group, Barbara, who taught kindergarten for 34 years, and Imogene, who spent her career as a court reporter and has the driest sense of humor of anyone I have ever met. My life is mine again. I say that simply because it is the most important thing I can say. There was a period longer than I admitted to anyone, even Warren, when I was not sure I would get it back, when I had started to believe the version of me that Derek and Tammy had constructed, diminished, confused, in need of management. It is a frightening thing to almost lose yourself not to illness or age, but to someone else's deliberate effort. It is also, I have come to understand, survivable. There are things I wish I had known. I wish I had understood what a power of attorney actually means before I signed one. I wish I had known that signing financial documents under stress and medication is something that can be challenged legally. I wish I had known about elder law attorneys and the specific protections available to people in situations like mine, because there are more people in situations like mine than I ever imagined. Women, especially, people who worked their whole lives and trusted the wrong person and found themselves, somehow, at the far edge of their own lives. I know those things now. And I know that Warren found me not by accident, but by persistence, by refusing to accept that a forwarded phone number and a second-hand account of my happiness was enough. He kept looking until he found the real number, and then he called it, and Patricia answered, and she brought the phone to room 14. I think about Patricia sometimes. I think about Marcus and the extra blanket, and I think about what it means to work in a place like that, and to still see the person in front of you, as a person and not a room number. Small kindnesses of that kind are not small. They are sometimes the thing that keeps someone going long enough to be found. My tomato plants are in the backyard now, not a windowsill. They have room. They are doing considerably better. Derek called once, about 4 months after the settlement. I let it go to voicemail. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't meant for things to go as far as they did. That particular phrase, which I have heard that people use when they mean they're sorry they got caught rather than sorry for what they did. I didn't call him back. That was my choice, and I am at peace with it. Some doors, once you close them, are not meant to be reopened, and some hands, once they have been clasped across a table in a common room by a brother who flew across the country to find you, those hands hold on. Mine do. I rebuilt. I redefined. And I am, at 67 years old, more certain of who I am and what I am worth than I have been in a very long time. That is not nothing. In fact, it is everything.